Hey, vinyl community, Mark here again from Sound Matters, talking all things vinyl as always. Hope you're all well out there. Today's topic is mono versions of songs or albums that sound significantly different to their stereo counterparts. Having just been revisiting a lot of the Beatles material, where of course, it's that mid-60s to late 60s period where there are mono and stereo versions of those albums, and sometimes there can be significant difference between each one of them. So I thought it'd be an interesting kind of topic off the back of my inspiration there to just go through some obvious examples that I've come across and then hand it over to you so that you can share your examples of albums or songs where the mono and the stereo mix have significant differences. Let's get straight into that topic. So before we get into the first example, let's just have a basic understanding of what we're dealing with here. With a mono recording, of course, we take a multi-track recording and we're outputting to one speaker. So all of the channels are mixed down to one channel, naturally, right? With stereo, I think we all understand that we then introduce a left and a right channel. But in terms of the mixing engineer's job, it changes things quite dramatically, because with mono, in terms of creating a separation between individual tracks and instruments, you're pretty much just dealing with things like EQ, so changing the balance of frequencies, but also, reducing or increasing the volume of a particular track. And on top of that, in terms of creating a sense of depth or space, it's the percentage of reverberant sound versus the direct sound. If we want to make a track or a voice or an instrument sound like it's further away, then you'd increase the amount of reverberant sound and decrease the amount of direct recorded sound, and vice versa. If we want it to sound a little bit more upfront, close, personal, intimate, then increase the direct sound of the individual voice or instrument and decrease that reverberant sound. So you make it sound drier is the term that they would use. So those basic elements, so EQ, level of individual tracks, and also sense of space, are really the main ways that they can separate and create an individual part or space within the frequency range for that instrument or voice to sit. There is more to it, of course, but for the purpose of this video, we're keeping things simple. Things like compression naturally come into this, of course, as well. But when we introduce now stereo, two channels that we can use, we can now create a sense of stereo width. So we can have individual, instruments or voices coming more from one side of that stereo image or the other, or we can keep it dead center, make it so that it's coming equally from both speakers. And that gives a sense of width, but also gives more individual separation. Things are less kind of piled on top of each other. So it does make it easier to separate out instruments, and that's of course why stereo became so popular and eventually won the day by the time we get to about 1970 and onwards. But it's interesting to look back on some of those mono mixes because they do have an individual character of their own. And because stereo was new back in the day, it kind of often suffers from what I call new toy syndrome, in that they kind of overdo it with any production technique that comes into music. It's always often overdone when it's new. Think of things like gated reverb in the 1980s. That was done to death. That's just one example. But stereo back in these days kind of went through that process as well. But I've talked enough about that now. I think we're all on the same page. Let's get into those examples. So my first example is the Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I was inspired to cover this one in particular, having just picked up an original mono copy of Sgt. Pepper's. Now, besides the usual differences in instrument separation, which I've briefly touched on already, the most noticeable difference in the mono version of Lucy in the Sky is the trippy flanging effect on John Lennon's lead vocal, which isn't there in the stereo mix, at least not in the same way. The flanging effect seems to take preference over the vocal harmonies in the mono mix, while on the stereo version, the harmonies are much more pronounced, at least to my ears anyway. Other differences include a much more buried lead guitar in the mono mix and a more gradual fade out at the end of the track. Before we move on to example 2, I should say that you can hear these examples for yourself down in a link that I'll put in the description below. I've pulled together some YouTube clips which demonstrate the differences between the mono and the stereo versions. In some cases, interestingly, because people have uploaded these kind of things, there are mono vinyl rips, recordings of those actual things that have gone onto YouTube, so it's interesting to hear. And in some cases, wherever possible in terms of me being able to find a clip, you can hear some of those original 60s mono versions. Number 2, I've selected the Beatles, I'm Only Sleeping. Now, the Beatles records are famously different different in mono, with many subtle differences which actually appear to have been ironed out to a certain degree on a lot of the mono remasters. But one example that still remains that I've picked up on at least is the mono mix of I'm Only Sleeping, where the reverse guitar parts are mixed in at slightly different places. In some cases they could even be different takes altogether. Some really interesting stuff just to pick up some of those subtle little differences in terms of when those reverse guitar parts come in and how they sound on that mono version. Example 3 is Pink Floyd Interstellar Overdrive, and I think this is a really good one. The outro of Interstellar Overdrive is drastically different on the stereo version. The original mono mix has a natural dynamic lift based on the opening riff, while the stereo version is one of the decade's most notorious examples of extreme psychedelic stereo panning. It's nuts. Next up we have Jefferson Aeroplane with Surrealistic Pillow. Now the stereo mix of this album is often criticised for sounding very washed out with reverb and having unnatural instrument spacing. This is a very common criticism, as I say, with early stereo mixes, which, as I stated in the intro of this video, they often suffer from that new toy syndrome, and that leads to many fans feeling a certain kind of disconnect with the stereo version, and instead they prefer, in many cases, many fans do anyway, the tighter, more cohesive sound of the original mono mix. Again, link in the description below where you can hear this example for yourself. Next up is an example that kind of carries on from what I've just covered with Jefferson Aeroplane in terms of the unnatural separation of individual tracks based on the ability that all of a sudden we can pan things, so we're going to do it in an extreme and unnatural way. So as I said earlier, you know, when a technology is new, it's often overdone, and in the case of early stereo mixes, it's not uncommon for instruments to be panned hard left or hard right in those early days. So in extreme cases, you can have examples where the bass guitar might be coming from the left speaker only, while the guitar and vocals are positioned almost entirely to the right side of the stereo field, and that's just one example. You can have examples where the drums are panned all the way over to one side or the other, for example, in some extreme cases as well. You know, take the Beatles' Rubber Soul, where you can hear this exact quality for yourself. This excessive use of stereo separation can sound unnatural, particularly when listening on headphones. Some listeners just actively despise some of those early unnatural stereo mixes. The last example before I hand it over to you guys is one from Bob Dylan. Now, Dylan's 1966 classic Blonde on Blonde is a typical example of how early stereo mixes were often a bit of an afterthought. Now, we know this because Dylan's producer famously went on record to say that the mono version was their chief priority at the time. After all, this was how most people were going to, at that time, experience the record. Stereo was relatively new, relatively in its infancy. So in a candid statement, he claimed, and I will quote him here, "We mixed that in mono for probably 3 or 4 days. And then I said, oh man, we've got to do stereo." So me and a couple of other guys put their hands on the board and we mixed that son of a in about 4 hours. So my point is, it took a long time to do the mono, and then it was like, oh yeah, we've got to do stereo. Now, when you hear quotes like that, it's like, you know, they really probably didn't know an awful lot about what they were doing at that time. They were still playing with the medium, still playing with the idea of a stereo field. It was all new. It was definitely a bit of an afterthought at that time. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad, that stereo mixes are bad, but I think it demonstrates the mentality of the people producing these albums at the time. They've been used to doing mono, all of a sudden they've got to have a stereo version to release, and it's a bit of a rush, and they're kind of learning on the job perhaps. So that can produce some of those slightly more unnatural results that we find so famously with those early stereo mixes. Some people love it, the whole novelty of it, the more extreme, more obvious version of it, while other people find it a little bit off-putting, particularly if you're listening to headphones. So I think actually that mono versus stereo mixes from albums of this particular period is all just part of the fun of record collecting. It's part of the quirk of the whole medium. It's a little bit of history in your hands, because if you search any of these examples on a streaming platform, it will be the stereo version that you will hear. There's probably an entire generation of people who have grown up hearing only the stereo versions of those classic Beatles albums, for example. And thanks to the resurgence in interest of vinyl records, we're helping to preserve those unique earlier versions of those albums, or at least those mono versions that sat parallel with those stereo releases at the time. It's all part of preserving, I think, an element of music history that without the resurgence in vinyl could eventually just be lost forever, and that would be a real shame. It's all good fun. Having two different versions of a track just adds to the experience, adds to the whole collectability of vinyl. I just love it. So that concludes today's topic, and it's over to you. Let us know your examples of mono versus stereo mixes down in that comments section below. Let us know your thoughts on mono overall. Let us know your thoughts on early stereo mixes. Some people find them just completely and utterly unlistenable, or at least, irritating, particularly on headphones. So I'm keen to hear your views. What do you think? Do you like mono records? Do you hate mono records? Are you a anti-early stereo kind of person? Love to hear from you out there in the wider vinyl community. And if you are new to this channel, please do consider subscribing. I'd love to have you on board, but until then, keep spinning.